Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chi Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, Sarah Williamson, CEO of FCLTGlobal, shares her insights on various subjects, including the differences between public and private investments, the critical transition to clean energy, and the modernization of pension systems. Delving into tools for investors and their long-term value impact, Sarah emphasizes the importance of climate considerations in portfolio management and critiques the outdated U.S. pension system, highlighting the efficiency of the Australian superannuation system. Listen in.
Sarah Williamson, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Bill, thanks so much for having me as your guest today.
A pleasure. And we've intersected in various degrees over the last maybe decade or so. And you've had a very interesting career. It's covered banking, the private sector, the public sector, consultancy. And it's always good to begin these discussions around the point of view of the guests. So maybe just a quick overview about you and your career, and then certainly want to spend the bulk of the time on what you're doing at FCLT.
Sure, thank you. So, quick career summary. I studied economics, went to Wall Street as a young analyst, did investment banking for Goldman Sachs when it used to be a small firm, mergers and acquisitions banking. And then I had the opportunity to work at the U.S. State Department. So that was my first foray into things that were very global. Went to business school, spent 5 years at McKinsey, and then spent over 20 years at Wellington in a number of areas. And I think that's where we first met, Bill, because I was one of the early guinea pigs to take the Kaya exam, because one of my roles there was being the director of alternative investments. So I left there 7 years ago when we founded FCLTGlobal, which is a nonprofit organization. This stands for Focusing Capital on the Long Term. And our mission is just that, to focus capital on the long term to support a sustainable and prosperous economy. So I've been fortunate to have a variety of experiences from the private sector to the public sector and now in the nonprofit world, but all with this idea of some intersection of markets and global and where the future may take us.
Thank you for your membership, Micaiah. You're also a CFA charter holder too, I believe.
I am, yes.
I think you invited myself and I think Melissa Allen at the time. I don't know if Wellington, it was a morning meeting, but it was a beautiful space. And I think you had most of the folks there and gave us an opportunity to talk about professionalism, what's going in the alt space. So I think that's a great platform, great firm as well. If I think about careers, mine as well, Sarah, they have seasons to them, I guess, to some degree. And was there a spark that took you from a very successful and senior position at a global firm like Wellington to say, hey, I'm going to now move toward the not-for-profit space, and I guess the founding CEO of FCLT. What was the catalyst for that?
So really the catalyst was the founding of FCLT. So I loved Wellington. I was very happy there. I didn't have any plans to leave. But some people that I knew had this idea of focusing capital in the long term. And Dominic Barton, who at the time ran McKinsey, had written an article for the Harvard Business Review, essentially decrying the problems of quarterly capitalism, the quarterly cycle, and how that was leading to short-term behavior, which was really not driving the best outcomes for businesses or for their range of stakeholders. And then he teamed up with Mark Wiseman, who at the time ran the Canada Pension Plan, and said really a big part of this is because of the investor. And so the investor is typically putting pressure on companies to be shorter term. And so there was this idea that they had, and then they also got Dow, BlackRock, and Tata from India involved. And the 5 of them really were establishing this organization. They had gotten a number of people together. They'd really thought about this idea quite a bit. And they went out looking for a CEO. And I had known Dom from my years at McKinsey and was really just taken with this idea because as a long-term investor, as somebody who's been in the markets for so many years, I recognized the power of capital markets and the power of capitalism itself to bring people out of poverty, to drive good outcomes, to drive economic mobility. But the problems that we often run into, which usually are around being very short term, putting the short term in front of the long term, just sort of bringing earnings forward, if you will. And this idea of combining a mission orientation with deep knowledge of capital markets was very, very attractive to me. So I made the probably quite surprising to many of my colleagues decision to officially retire from Wellington a bit early and take on a role leading a nonprofit instead.
I think about the importance of long-termism. I think if there's one lesson we can ingrain in the skull of every investor is you can't market time your way to better outcomes. But we seem like we're going to die trying to do that. And it's a very tough habit to break. And I think over the long term, we know things go in cycles. We had this whole narrative, the 60-40 last year being dead. Now, like Lazarus, I think has risen back up again. And maybe after digesting a 400 to 500 basis point increase in rates, maybe that's what happens. But we seem to panic. I think the popular media maybe fans these flames. And I think also maybe our industry does to some degree because there's always a product to sell as opposed to trying to really focus. And this theme has come up a lot, Sarah, on this podcast, focusing on the liability side of the balance sheet. And if you look at the duration of those liabilities, you should think about matching your investments against that. And oftentimes you're going to find that that will dictate a long-term lens. And I think that's a much better way to approach it. So you can certainly comment on that, but then maybe talk about the differences between the public markets, which you alluded to. They have earning calls and EPS expectations. They miss those, the stock gets hammered, versus the long-term view in the private markets and more patient capital, and there are issues there too. So there's a couple of openings there that maybe you can provide comments and color.
I'll step back a little bit and say that what we think we're trying to do at FCLT is really 3 things. The first is lengthen investment time horizons. So if you're investing for this afternoon, you don't really get to worry about sustainability and all of those sorts of things. So lengthen investment time horizons. The second is broaden business objectives. So who's involved? Who are the range of stakeholders? What's going on? Because we work with companies as well as investors, obviously. And so how do we think about broadening that business lens such that you can create a long-term successful company, but treat the planet well at the same time, for example? And then the third thing is thinking about how can capital markets really be an engine of economic mobility? In other words, how can they drive the outcomes that we would like to see? So if we sort of go back to first principles, remember at one end of this, why do we have capital markets in the first place? At one end of the spectrum, they're savers, and they're probably saving for a long-term goal, like their retirement or their children's education or whatever it might be. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's a company or a person who's got an idea and they need capital, and they need capital to innovate or to grow, to do something with that idea. So the whole point of capital markets, if we sort of take a step back, is to serve that saver who's got some sort of long-term goal and fund innovation, which of course helps society and communities. And everything we do in the middle is really in service of those. Now, we all know, those of us who've spent time in the markets, that's not what we're thinking about every day. If you're sitting there trading your portfolio, you're not really thinking about the saver, you're not really thinking about the community that might be affected by the innovation or the bad behavior, whichever it may be. So I think that the way that I think about this, at least, is how can that flow of capital from the saver, usually to an asset owner, so a pension plan who may have a certain set of liabilities, usually then to an asset manager who has a certain set of objectives they're trying to reach, into the company, how does that process really create value? So I'm going to come back to your private-public question in a minute. But if we think about that investment value chain, I often ask myself, well, how is each one in that process creating value? So what a really good asset owner does is they understand, to your point, they understand their liabilities. They've got liabilities 20 years out, or perhaps they're a sovereign wealth fund and it's generational. And they really think about how do they meet those liabilities. They don't get caught up in the this year? Did I beat the university across town thing? Am I serving what I'm supposed to serve in terms of the beneficiaries or the purpose of the money? What's the mission of the money? The asset managers, it's the same thing. The really good ones are trying to build long-term value for their clients in a way that is not just a zero-sum game. It's not just alpha in the classic sense of the word, which is zero-sum, but is helping that asset owner meet their long-term liabilities, meet their needs. And then the company, we have to remember that most of the value that's created is actually in the company space. Real people going to work every day, coming up with new ideas, delivering a service, building a product, whatever it might be. That is the point.
So this is a global opportunity and a global challenge. And having looked at the governance of FCLT, it is remarkably global. And I assume that was on purpose. Your remit is the world, not just North America, not just the US or Canada. Is that correct? You're focusing on outcomes.
Yes. We are called FCLTGlobal, and we take the global part very seriously. And I think that's for several reasons. The first is, obviously, we live in a global world, but particularly if you think about capital markets, they are global. Most large companies are very global. One of our members and one of our board members is Unilever. I think they operate in 195 countries or some enormous number. So clearly a very global. And so we really try to think about this from a global perspective and both a public and private perspective. So I think that one way to think about us is if you think about a trade association, it tends to be people in the same industry, usually in the same country. We're the opposite of that. So our members are not in the same industry. We have sovereign wealth funds and pension plans and other sorts of investors. We have private equity managers. We have public equity managers. And then we have companies in every sort of vertical you could imagine. Banking to consumer products to energy to chemicals, all sorts of things. And so what we're trying to do is say, what are the links across those? And capital is the thread that binds those together.
Maybe finishing with this private versus public company conundrum, my word, not yours. But if I think about, as I said earlier, public company has to report earnings every quarter, and that's put certain short-term pressures on management and the stock price, and that's keep shareholders happy. But then on the private side, there are challenges as well, where that could be a 3 to 5 year, maybe on the long end, a 7-year hold. And as you get near the end, you're thinking about an exit. And the exit you're looking for might be for the best price as opposed to the best next owner, because you have a fiduciary responsibility to get the very best price. So all things being equal, if you're thinking about financial capital for the long term, or focusing the capital for the long term, is it easier in a public company or private company setting? And maybe they're both hard. I don't know what your views are on that. You think about patient capital should be easier, but maybe not so much.
I think it's funny because every public company CEO probably thinks it's easier to be private. And every private, especially private equity-backed portfolio company CEO that I know says, have you ever met these people? They count their pennies very carefully. So I think that I'm not sure there's an easier or harder, but I do think it's a difference. And I think that the difference is that you have different sets of tools. And the same is true for investors. So let's start on the investor side. Is it easier to manage money or better to manage money one way or another? We could argue about that all day, but you have different set of tools. So let's say you're an index manager. You cannot sell the stock because you don't like what the company's doing, but you probably are large and you probably have a lot of votes. If you're an active manager and you like the company, you buy more. If you don't like the company, you walk away. Let's say you're a hedge fund manager, perhaps you've got more tools. You can use shorting as well as going long. You really don't like the company, you short it. Maybe you're a private equity manager. You buy the whole thing and you can hire and fire the CEO. So to me, it's you have a different set of tools. And the question is, given the set of tools that you have, whatever chair you happen to sit in, how do you take those tools and use them to create that long-term value for all of the stakeholders who are involved? The best people in each one of those fields think about what are those things. And those tools are usually governance. What's the governance structure? Very different in a public space than a private space. Incentives. How do you pay people? If you pay people to be short-term, they generally will be. And to your point on public versus private, I think of public as, yes, they report every day, but in the private equity world, it's time limited. There is an exit date. So again, different tools, but that's a different incentive. What are the metrics? How do you measure? That really matters a lot. That's, I think, a critical lever. What is the investment corporate dialogue? What is that relationship? If you're, again, in a private equity-backed company, probably your owners are sitting on your board. If you're a big public company, you've got board members who represent shareholders, but they're not your big shareholders. Again, very different how that dialogue works. And then we also think of public policy as part of an important backdrop to the differences between the way different entities can operate. So again, what tools do you have? How do you use each one of those to be as long-term as possible?
And it might be instructive, Sarah, to talk about this through the lens of a transition from carbon to renewable energy. This is a complex transition. It's an expensive transition. Massive infrastructure investment is required. Global GDP is addicted to fossil fuels, and that can't change overnight. And I think you alluded to it at the top of this discussion that if your time horizon is tomorrow, you're not going to get compensated for the avoidance of a climate risk. So it's inherent that you look at this challenge through a long-term lens. How we accomplish that, I'm less sure, but you've been very active in trying to get like-minded bodies like Kaya and the CFA, and I was part of a consortium of folks globally that you gathered together just a few short months ago. I thought it was an excellent discussion, but it's going to take more than a handful of associations to move the needle. We've got to get the attention of the capital itself. Where are we in this transition, and how do we maybe accelerate it because time is not on our side?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's absolutely the case. And I think that my own view is that the transition is critical. We need to accelerate it, and we need to also have it be a just transition. So, it's easy for us in North America, in houses that have heat, to say everybody should stop where they are. But if you're in some countries where you can't keep your medicines cold, you're going to need fossil fuels. So I think we just have to recognize that just transition part is also critically important. So the way we've thought about this from the investor point of view is to be honest and look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, what am I doing with my portfolio? And we think there's really 4 things you can do with your portfolio, and you may do all of these. One is to be silent about climate in a portfolio. And to your point on if you're investing for tomorrow, it probably doesn't matter very much. I don't know many people who have a carbon issue in their cash portfolio. They are silent about climate in their cash portfolio. That's completely fine. So you could be silent on all of it. Probably not a good idea, but certainly on portions of it, it's fine. The next is that I think about is some people are principled. They don't want something, let's say thermal coal, whatever it is, not because of any economic reason, but because they think it's bad, it's wrong, and they don't want to own it. And that's principled. Again, I respect that. It comes out of, as I'm sure you know, socially responsible investing. It was really formed in a religious tradition. And there are a lot of people who invest where they will not buy something, whether it's alcohol or tobacco or whatever it might be, just because they think it's wrong. And so there are a lot of people in that camp. And I think of that as a principled investing. It may or may not have any effect on the planet, but it makes them feel good about the way they've invested their money. The third thing that we think about, which is increasingly critical, is an analytical approach, which is to assume that we're not going to have a transition, or that there's not going to be climate change, or that carbon is not going to be priced, seems to me to be a very bad assumption. So anyone who is looking to the future, just like in any other investment issue, like where are rates going or inflation or anything else, you need to think about what's the price of carbon going to be? How's this going to affect my portfolio? I always say if you're going to invest in a bridge, you want to know where the water's going to be in 20 years. So it's just plain old good investing. And I would argue that not doing that is a violation of fiduciary duty. It's just bad management. You've got to think about this. It's a huge force. And then the last thing we think about is what we call catalytic investing, which is, especially if you're a big investor, you can throw your weight around a little bit. And what we mean by that is you can engage with companies and talk with them about how they're doing a transition. You can make your views known. You can try to create new markets. You can invest in green technology that hopefully might actually have an impact. So those are the ways that we really think about how could a portfolio be structured that is honest. It's not greenwashing, but maybe you're silent in part of it. Maybe you're principled in part of it, not because it's really going to affect the world, but because it's important to you. Maybe you're analytical, because you really should be if you're thinking about the future. And maybe you're catalytic. Maybe you can make some change. And we hope that the more people that think about their portfolio and what they really can do with that portfolio, not just to make a green portfolio, but to drive towards a green planet, that will help us in this transition.
And where are we on carbon pricing on the analytical side? A very important point you raised, but I'm not a student of this, but I think in North America and certainly the US, we really have nothing to show for that.
I would put it in a couple of different buckets. One is a proper carbon tax, which the Europeans are doing, and that's going to be real, and other people will end up doing that. And so that's real money that you have to pay to somebody. Obviously, we're not there in the United States, and I'm not going to predict that we get there anytime soon. Having said that, many companies now, forward-looking companies, are doing a shadow carbon price. So what they're saying is, if I could allocate my capital to project A or project B, let's say they both look the same on a pre-carbon tax basis, but maybe one's much more carbon heavy than the other. If you carbon tax it or have a shadow price, you build that into your calculation, maybe you choose A over B. Again, that's just very smart investing, forward-looking investing. One of the things that we're working on right now, which frankly we haven't quite figured out yet, but we're getting pretty close, is how can you do that for a portfolio? So if you thought about a fully loaded portfolio, if your portfolio were really had to pay a carbon tax, or if you wanted to do an internal charge on yourself to understand what the cost really is, how would you go about pricing a portfolio for that? And that's a project we've actually got underway right now. We would welcome input and ideas on it.
And I think this is where the global remit pays a dividend, because we could sit back and say the carbon tax or carbon pricing is a challenge in the US. We hope that somebody in Europe imports it someday. You have the ability to look to see what's going on in these markets and perhaps bring it to the shores of the US. And maybe we've got some hope there. As we began this, as you ticked off this list of 4, noticeably absent for the right reason is when it's convenient. And I think oftentimes that gets in the way. And I saw it somewhere today, it might have been the FT, this ExxonMobil and Engine One, that seems to have sort of just dissipated. And there was a shareholder resolution on Scope 3 emissions, and they voted against it, and not so much an indictment of that. But it seems like there's just a lot of hope and false starts, and we move ahead, and some of these initiatives that we think we're going to make progress sort of flame out again. So I would assume you would agree sustainability and effort and progress is critically important, and that's what we've got to be able to point to if we're going to see success here.
Yes, and I think business reality. So the way that I think about this is the idea that 5 or 10 years from now, we'll have the same sorts of economy, the same sorts of issues that we have today, like that has never been true. Okay, so what you do as a good long-term investor is you say, what's happening this minute is important, but really what's important is what's going to happen in the future. And markets typically are pretty good at pricing that. We price recessions before they actually happen, all of those sorts of things. So the way that I think about this is not that businesses or companies have to act like the government or do this, that, or the other thing because it's their job. Their job is to invest money as well as they can for the future. That future, the decarbonization of the future will happen. How fast, exactly which technology, exactly what tax, we could argue about that all day, but that train has left the station. So the question is, as an investor, how do you invest in the winners there and avoid the losers? And the winners in the future are going to be the people who figure out how to provide a lower carbon product or service. And that is already happening, where people are trying to lock up supply chains that have lower carbon than the next guy. And that is just going to be a part of competing. And I think that is what drives businesses and investors to make good decisions on an ongoing basis, rather than a commitment or an initiative or a PR campaign or something like that. It's just good business to get this done.
I agree. And also your thought about the train leaving the station. It's like maintaining your home. You can ignore it. Then eventually you've got to rebuild it from the ground up because the structure has gotten so unsound. And I do worry that our generation has not been a responsible owner of this issue. And is the world going to come to an end in your lifetime and mine? Probably not. But the legacy we're leaving with our children and our grandchildren, and that is the ultimate in long term. I just hope that they can afford to get this fixed, because I don't know if our generation has done enough to move the needle.
Well, I agree. But if you're a business or an investor right now that's trying to hire the best smart young talent, you can't act like a dinosaur, because the best smart young talent does not want to go work for dinosaurs. So adapting to the future and being a place that is forward-looking and diverse and cares about the planet and cares about people in society, I think is just table stakes now.
Maybe not a perfect comparison, but you look at before, during, and after COVID. Maybe it's the dinosaurs that are demanding people back 5 days a week. And this next generation is balking at it, saying, well, that's how your career developed. And things worked just fine during COVID, and I ain't coming back. And I don't know if that's, I said, a fair comparison or not, but it just shows the power of the consumer behavior when it's measured in cohorts by age of a workforce, and how powerful that can be. So the point you just made does give me some hope.
Something that we wrote it was actually rewrote originally during COVID, but I'm sure you remember from your psychology class, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What do you have to do to work your way up? And if you think about this in a business context, it's really, for most businesses, could be different for some, but that bottom one is the employees. So if you don't have employees, particularly in a labor-constrained environment or a talent-driven market, if you don't have employees who want to work for you, you don't get to the next level. You don't have customers, you got a serious problem on your hands. Then maybe it's your suppliers. Maybe it's suppliers of capital, but maybe it's the suppliers of good. And so whatever the business is, you go all the way up. And so I think when sometimes people think about these being trade-offs, are we nice to our employees or do I make money for the shareholders? They're not trade-offs. That's how you move up that hierarchy. And the best companies and the best investors are the ones who really attract and retain those people, have clients that they serve well, understand all of the things that really make them, maybe it's the regulation, the government relations, whatever it may be, but what is it that makes them successful? And they work up that chain.
In the remaining couple of minutes, Sarah, I want to talk about the future of retirement and a couple of trends that are hard to ignore. Most of us are covered by a 401k or a 403b plan, so we do not have that collective defined benefit plan of our parents' generation. And even where we do, in the corporate space, they've been largely annuitized, and today's employee cannot get in. And in the public pension plan space, maybe parts of the U.S. and Canada aside, the funding levels are not very good, and the demographics are not very good either. So there's a lot of short to medium-term pressures on these benefit plans, but the ultimate responsibility is going to be the hands of you and I as individuals, and there's a tremendous disparity of wealth. So a lot tucked in there, but maybe your views on the future of retirement. And I know some of this might be well outside of the FCLT mission, but ultimately, if we want to be good citizens to the global universe, we've got to find better and more fair outcomes for all investors, and just too many of people around the world not on that grid.
First of all, I totally agree with you. And I think we wrote something for Forbes a little while ago about ERISA being your father's Oldsmobile. I mean, it's old, right? It was ERISA, the US law is over 50 years old. And it was written for just a different time where people went to one job, they stayed there at their whole career, and they retired from that place. And then frankly, they didn't live very long until they passed away. So that's not the world we live in today. What I would love to see in the United States is something very similar to the Australian system. And you may be familiar with it, but essentially the way it works, it's called a superannuation. But it's what we would call defined contribution or 401k. But it's got a few really important distinctions that are very different from ours. And they put this in place just over 25 years ago, and it's worked extremely well, and we should learn from their experiments. So there are a couple things that are very important about it. The first is that there's a mandatory contribution from an employer. If you make a salary of $100, your employer then makes a contribution on top of it. So it's not a match. It's not out of your salary. It's a contribution on top. Now, there are ways you can top it up and so on, but basically that means you can't opt out. You must opt in. There is no opt out. So everybody saves something. And obviously some people save more than others, but everybody saves something. It is a individual-centered system, not an employer-centered system. So it's not, I work for XYZ company and therefore I have their pension plan. It's that I'm Sarah and I have an account with my name on it. And if I work for XYZ company, I go there. And if I work for ABC company, I go there. And so the analogy is, if you think about what we do in this country, if you change jobs from one place to another, you don't change bank accounts. You just tell your new employer to send your paycheck to your bank account. Well, that's basically the model there. You just tell your new employer, oh, this is where my superannuation in their case is. So that's the second thing, is it's not employer centered. It's employee or individual centered. It's somebody's their own. The third thing is they are very tightly regulated and they have had a huge amount of consolidation. So my colleagues in the investment management business will know that they have the lowest fees in the world. So the Australians have very large assets because they've consolidated them into a smaller number of funds, and therefore they drive the cost down, and their regulator forces them to drive it down. And then the last thing that I think is really unique about that system is that an individual has choice. So let's say I'm at the equivalent of Fidelity and I don't like Fidelity, then I can move to Vanguard. It's the same thing there. If you're with Aussie Super and you don't like the job they're doing, you can move your money over to Hesta. And that means there's competition among the pension plans themselves. And so is it a perfect system? No, we could talk about its problems, but it is so much better than our system that if I were able to, I would have us just copy their system and that would be good enough.
Well, if you get anointed the head of solving for this, you have my vote. And I talk about this example myself too. You're almost taking the words out of my mouth. And implicit to what you just said is professional management. So if you and I as individuals, and maybe we're bad examples because you grew up in this industry, but you take a medical doctor or a lawyer, how are they going to find the very best private equity GP or the very best infrastructure GP? They don't stand a chance. But if you've got the buying power of a collective vehicle like a superannuation fund, that is an awesome, awesome opportunity. Music to my ears.
That's what I would do if I were queen for the day. Yes. Transform our retirement system. And I don't think you'd have to touch the state plans or touch the Social Security or any of the other sort of third rails. We could do it pretty easily. The last thing I'll say on that is that I've never met an employer that says, well, I really enjoy administering a retirement plan. Nobody likes to do it. So I think companies would be very, very happy to get rid of it.
And also, if you look at the choices they have to offer, the litigation risk is enormous for them to put on an interval fund or a BDC. So they keep these garden variety, uninteresting options and just paints us into a corner where we just don't have a lot of choice. So I think it's very much of a win-win. How we get from one side to the other, there is always the rub. But when you get anointed to that position, Sarah, hopefully I'll help you fix it.
We need to get our Australian friends to come share their experience.
Excellent. You have someone on your board, so I'm counting on you.
Oh, we've got plenty. We got plenty of Aussies, and they know it well. So
excellent. All right. Well, Sarah, great to hear from you again. Hope to see you soon. Enjoy the waning days of August. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the CAIA Association and subscribe to the show at caia.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.